Welcome you all this evening. My name is Claude Destray. I am a professor here at the Joseph Korbel School of International Studies. And I wear a number of different hats. I'm the director of the Human Rights Degree Program, the Human Trafficking Clinic, and the director of the Center for Rights Development, CORD, as we refer to it. And CORD is one of the very oldest centers here. And last year we did, our 12th annual symposium. The way CORD functions is that in recent years, about 3 years ago, we made a decision to look at a variety of human rights instruments. And as you may be aware, the International Bill of Rights includes the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the ICESCR, which I never get the acronym right, so I have to write it down, which is the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. It's that third one that is probably the least known, the least understood, the least written about, and probably because in some ways, probably so, it's vague and it's hard, some ways hard to define. And so CORD took that on as the international instrument that we are going to focus our attention on for a number of years, probably at least a good decade, and try to take on subject matters that it mentions or refers to as basic human rights. But we still need clearly to be further defined. Scholarly work needs to be done on. So last year, for instance, we did the right to water and water rights, and before that it was
Middle East.
The Middle East. And this year we're talking about the right to education. I think that's interesting because I also teach a basic course on international law and human rights. And one of the issues that I raise all the time is, though, if you look at any of these documents, if you look at the UN Declaration on Human Rights, you will notice by just going through its articles, maybe a solid 50 basic human rights that are articulated. And if you know anything about how human rights are explained, they're all co-equal. It's not a hierarchy. It's not meant to be a hierarchy. They're all co-equal. So there are 50 sort of basic ones, and then all the documents that have come have added, continually add more human rights are co-equal with all the previous ones. But here's the reality that I suggest to the class, and I suggest to you, and you know too much about this already, is that the reality is that we have a hierarchy of human rights. Each one of us in this room has a hierarchy of human rights. And the exercise we did in class is I asked people to list 20 human rights that they could think of before I do my first lecture and say these are what 50, so you can cheat. It's the ones you had to already know. And out of the ones that you chose, what is your hierarchy, your top 10, and list them in priority. What's important here is, of course, is that to know that if you do work in human rights, is that you're going to see it through your lens. And of course, nation states do the same thing. This is not unimportant because if we have a hierarchy of human rights, then we are going to assess certain resources based on the hierarchy that we have articulated, either as individuals, as a community, as a nation. Now, what I found really curious was that you might expect that if you were thinking about human rights, that the number one human right that everybody would put down in class would be the right to life. But that's not what happened. And this ties in perfectly for tonight, because the number one human right that everyone in the class put down was the right to education. Now, I found that to be really curious. Now, that's not altogether surprising. Why? Because what's the focus of your attention right now in your lives? Right? So that's the lens you're going to see it through. And it's going to be this kind of lens that I'm going to see it through. So that's an important element for me of human rights. And the gentlemen here also, not because they're academics, and they're also in education and a dean of education. So needless to say, it's going to be an important issue. But I found it really quite fascinating, and it's quite telling, and it's proper, right? Because you could check in maybe 5 years from now, maybe education wouldn't be at the top of the list, but I suspect it will always be a parcel of what you consider to be something fundamental. And why? Because as we'll be articulating through the year culminating in the symposium, something I tell my kids all the time, and you were probably told by your parents, is that without an education you can't get any, right? We have noticed in this country, look at the economic recovery. The economic recovery is happening with people who have college educations, right? And it's not happening with people who have only high school educations. Now, I'm not an expert on that, but at least that's what NPR tells me, and of course, like the New York Times and Barack Obama, I believe anything that is told to me by these kinds of institutions. So tonight we begin a discussion. And it's a discussion that's both an international issue, but clearly also a domestic issue. So we will be tying those things back and forth, which is an important process for us. Before I forget, Andy told me to said that there's a sign-up sheet and a photo release sheet in there. I'm going to do the introduction. I have to disappear because I have to teach a class on international humanitarian law of armed conflict tonight, and I haven't finished preparing for it. My colleagues will open and with their own presentations, and then Annie will moderate a discussion and question and answer with all of you. I wish I could join you for that. I might sneak down during a break because they've got really nice goodies. We don't see them yet. Cream puffs, frozen cream puffs. Right, cool.
Good
So yes,
dessert.
I will definitely
Great dessert.
make a break. I will sort of time it for the end of this talk and swing down here with the people in my class in tow. So I'd like to introduce my colleagues. Dr. Devin Joshi here is a professor here at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies and has been with us since 2008. He is a recipient of multiple research fellowships and has been a visiting scholar in China, Germany, India, South Korea, and Sweden. He's a political scientist by training and does research on international development. His research cuts across a number of different fields, including international political economy, IPE, comparative politics, international education, and Asian studies. He looks at two major areas of research which are intertwined, as often we do. One is conceptualizing, comparing, measuring, and forecasting the future of different varieties of democracy, and advancing human development and the Millennium Development Goals, which you'll hear probably more and more about not only tonight, but in the months to come, because education is a clearly important issue as part of that, but specifically in the Global South and with a focus in India and China. I'm very pleased to have Dr. Gregory Anderson. Greg is a professor at the Morgridge College of Education and the Dean of the College of Education. I'm particularly delighted to have you here because I've been sending my students over because I have a big emphasis on methodology and statistics, which is something that we need more of here, and you do so well over there. So I put out a call to all of you who are interested, especially in human rights and those kinds of issues, that we need serious research about. You need to be educated in issues of methodology and statistics to be able to do that. Don't start rolling your eyes up in your head. You do need to do statistics to do this work properly. Before coming to DU in 2009, Dr. Anderson was an associate professor at Columbia University's Teachers College in its program in higher and post-secondary education. And in 2006, Greg was granted an extended leave from the Teachers College to become the Higher Education Policy Program Officer at the Ford Foundation in New York. And he was responsible for overseeing probably the largest, I think it's the largest portfolios, one of the largest portfolios at the foundation, featuring both international and domestic higher education grants. He also sat on executive committees of foundation partnerships and foundation-wide initiatives involving the United States, Africa, Central, Latin America, and Asia. And in 2008, he was appointed by the Vice President of the Foundation's Knowledge, Creativity, and Freedom Program Division to lead a strategic planning team responsible for developing a new vision for us, for the U.S. and for international higher education program. And we're delighted that we were able to wrest him away from the Beltway and environs, which is hard to do, but something must have attracted you, I hope, more than just the Rocky Mountains. But I'm delighted to have you here as the Dean of our College of Education. So with that, I'm going to turn it over. I don't know who's going to go first. And thank you both. If I don't see you, we'll see you for the cream puffs.
See you for the cream puffs.
Don't forget, cream puffs.
Thank you, Claude, for that nice introduction. And what I'm going to do is just talk for a little bit about the right to education. What does that mean? How has that historically evolved? And to give some international perspectives on that. So, just begin with a historical timeline. Prior to the 19th century, we didn't have the right to education as a global phenomenon, as a global way of thinking. In fact, there were little sprouts, mainly in Europe, of compulsory schooling or mass schooling, but it's only in the 19th century, during the time of the Industrial Revolution, that the idea of compulsory mass schooling as a forerunner of the right to education emerges. And it's only in the 20th century when the Soviet Union put the right to education into its constitution that we begin to see the constitutional legalization of the right to education for everyone in the society, as well as the obligation of the state to provide that right. After World War II, the United Nations declared the Declaration of Human Rights. Of the 30 articles in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, Article 26 in particular guarantees everyone a right to education. And the right to education, that when we think about it, stems from the Declaration on Human Rights, but it was expounded upon in several different conventions through the United Nations system. In 1960, through the UNESCO's Convention Against the Discrimination in Education. In the 1966 International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which was put into play in 1976. In the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which came into force in 1990. And in 1990, there was a really large global conference in Jomtien, which is a city in Thailand, where they put forth the Declaration of Education for All. The idea was that all people in all countries, regardless of their situation, girls, boys, etc., rural, urban, had a right to education, and that the global community would work at helping those nation states, those countries that were least advanced in their education progress towards this global goal of education for all. This was reiterated in 2000 in Dakar at another major world conference in Senegal, with the goal of universal primary education being set forth, as enshrined in the Millennium Development Goals, which is a series of 8 goals that the United Nations is working on, starting with the starting date of 2000 when they held the Millennium Summit, aiming to achieve these goals by the year 2015. 2 of the 8 goals apply specifically to education. Millennium Development Goal number 2, which is primary school completion for all boys and girls, also known as Education for All, and they have what is called the Fast Track Initiative, whereby the United Nations and partner institutions like the World Bank are putting funding into trying to get primary school completion for all boys and girls. Millennium Development Goal number 3 is also related to this because the goal is to have gender parity, that is equal enrollment of proportional enrollment of boys to girls at all levels of education, primary, secondary, and tertiary. Okay. How many of you have read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Okay, so about half or more. So you're familiar with this. Okay, here's a little quiz. Which article in the Declaration of Human Rights deals with the right to education? 26. Okay, good. Pay attention. All right. Let's go. Okay, let's look at the text of Article 26. Okay, there's 3 parts. First part, everyone has the right to education. So this is the first part. It's not a right that you earn because you're qualified. It's not a right that you earn because you live in a certain country or you're born into a certain family. It's that everyone has this right. Okay, the next sentence, education shall be free. Okay, so there's no cost to the child or to the family to have this education, at least in the elementary and fundamental stages. So elementary education, that's debated what that refers to. It usually means the first 5 to 9 years of schooling. Okay, elementary education should be compulsory. It means you have to go. You have no choice, whether you like it or not. And technical and professional education shall be made generally available, and higher education shall be equally accessible to all on the basis of merit. So the emphasis here is on primary education, on elementary education, but beyond that, there's an effort or there's a goal of making secondary and higher education available to the extent possible. The second aspect of the Article 26 deals with the content of the education. This is the curriculum aspect. education should be directed to the full development of the human personality. So it's not just math and English, or math and literacy. You take the SAT, GRE, these kinds of aptitude tests, and it's usually just mathematics and reading. But you have a right, according to the Declaration of Human Rights, and everyone has a right, to an education directed to the full development of the human personality, which includes strengthening respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. So you don't have to be at Cornell doing a degree in human rights or international studies and taking courses on human rights, or in Morgridge College of Education taking human rights and education courses. In fact, you have a right. You have a right, everyone has a right to human rights education. And an education that promotes understanding, tolerance, and friendship among all nations, racial or religious groups, furthering the activities of the United Nations for the maintenance of peace. So in fact, you have a right to a kind of education that makes you supportive of the United Nations and United Nations activities directed towards peace. Thirdly, parents have a prior right to choose the kind of education that shall be given to their children. So there's so many rights just in Article 26. Isn't that fantastic? There are some potential areas of conflict, however. Parents have the prior right to choose the kind of education for their children, but they may not choose a type of education that gives full development to the children's personality. They may not choose a kind of education that promotes respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms. They may not choose a kind of education that promotes friendship among nations, racial and religious groups. So here's one area of tension already in Article 26. Okay, the 1976 International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights expounds on the basic ideas set forth in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In Article 13 lays out several different conditions. Firstly, it reiterates the principle that primary education is compulsory in education and available and free to all. Beyond that, secondary education in its different forms, including technical and vocational secondary education, shall be made generally available and accessible to all by every appropriate means, and in particular by the progressive introduction of free education. Higher education as well shall be made equally accessible to all on the basis of capacity by every appropriate means, and in particular by the progressive introduction of free education. So what this means is that for those countries that can afford it, for those countries that are higher income countries, maybe even also middle income countries, they have a right, they have a duty actually, an obligation under the ICESCR to provide free secondary and higher education. So if you have to take out a loan for your education, or if you have to pay tuition for your education, your rights are violated. If you live in a country that has signed the ICESCR. Okay, next point. There is another condition here, that parents have the liberty to ensure religious and moral education of their children in conformity with their own convictions. So here we have a reiteration of many of the same principles set out in the 1948 Declaration. Okay, most countries of the world have signed and ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. There's a few countries that have not signed it, Saudi Arabia, Burma. There's a few countries that have signed it, but not ratified it. Go call up your congressman, call your senator, call your representative, and ask them, how come you're not signing the ICESCR? Why do I have to take out a $100,000 loan for my education? It's not like the country can't afford it. So, if you're upset about it, you can take action and try to change this. Okay, what does a rights-based approach to education mean beyond the legal instruments of the UN system and the international human rights treaties? Okay. I'm going to be pointing shooting as I know we have no clicker here. This is appropriate technology. Okay, right of access to education. That means, access means that it's available, that there are schools within walking distance or if there's public transportation to get to school, that everyone can go, girls, boys, rural areas, urban areas, poor, working class, middle class, upper class, all ethnic groups, and for all stages of childhood, not just for a few years, but it's available through the different stages of childhood. Right to quality of education means that the curriculum is relevant, that it includes those components that are specified in the Declaration of Human Rights and in the ICCR, that it's safe to go there, that one doesn't have to fear violence on the way to school or in the school in the classroom, school building, and that it's healthy, that the sanitation and so on is conducive to education. Respect in the learning environment is another aspect of a rights-based education. That different children or different students their identity is respected as individuals, that they have the right to participate in their education, and that their integrity is respected. A rights-based approach to education also means that the state, the government, has certain obligations. Okay, the government can't just shirk back and do nothing. It has to provide a legal framework that entitles those in those members of the population, all the citizens, to education. Secondly, it entails providing necessary resources for the implementation of education, and thirdly, monitoring to make sure that the actual implementation is taking place there. Along with providing the school infrastructure and the resources needed for compulsory education and so on, the state also has to do its part in eliminating child labor by making that illegal and enforcing that in places of employment. In addition, it's not just up to the government. Parents must do their part in guaranteeing that their children do, in fact, go to school and are getting the education to which they have a right. Okay, how do we evaluate the right to education? Okay. Take my class, Education and Development. We spent a week on this. I think we have a few people who are in my class now or in the past. One framework that has been used is called the 4 A's approach. You know, if you're a student, you're in school, you want to get A's, right? You know, so, hey, I'm getting 4 A's, well, that's great. It's better than having 4 I's, like your instructor. Okay, so this framework, which is easy to remember, you can quiz your friends. Do you know about the 4 A's? Is that education is available, it's accessible, it's acceptable, meaning it's good enough quality, and it's adaptable. In terms of global monitoring, the UNESCO, that is the United Nations Economic, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, puts out an annual report. It's called the Education for All Global Monitoring Report. It's available on the internet. You can download it as you like. And there they try to assess on a country-by-country basis global trends. The UNESCO has also put forth certain targets for public education spending. We know that financial resources are one of the major obstacles to implementing the right to education. 2 of these goals are, one, that government spending, about 20% or so, should be directed towards education, and that about 6% of the national income, the GDP, should be spent on education. Okay, what are the costs of having poor education in society? Because if you look at these numbers, 20% of total government spending, 6% of GDP, you know, it's not a small amount. It's a substantial amount. But if we don't put that kind of resources into education, we have to deal with a lot of other costs. If we have a poorly educated population globally or within different countries, we have to deal with the costs of unemployment, the costs of poorer health, the cost of a higher criminal justice costs from higher crime, cost and defense against crime, costs of public assistance, losses of government revenue. If children are not getting early stages of education, they're not going to be on to pursue higher education. the lower incomes that people have when they don't have an education, violence, resorting to drugs, and etc. We know for sure, and this graph is just an indication of this, that public education has dramatic economic benefits. Basically, the countries of the world can be split up into 3 quadrants. There's countries that are poor. This is a per capita income level here, and which have a low level of education. This is an education index made by the United Nations Development Program. Then we have countries that are wealthy and which have high levels of public education. And then there's a few countries that are not wealthy and have high levels of public education, but they're mostly in post-communist countries. What we don't have are countries with high levels of education and low income. I mean, we have sort of the United Arab Emirates with its oil wealth and Oman with its oil wealth slightly sneaking into this box, but that's it. So countries that want to develop, and we have a lot of countries in the global south that are trying to universalize education, trying to implement the right to education, they are likely to move in this trajectory, where expansion of education will be a necessary precursor to the kinds of economic development that they are seeking. Okay, I'll just point out a few of the deficits we faced when the Millennium Development Goals were set in place. I'll talk a little bit about the progress since then, and then I'll turn it over to Greg. The situation we faced at the beginning of the century was that almost 100 million children were not in primary school. Over 200 million children were not in secondary school, and there were close to 900 million people who were illiterate in the developing world. If you include illiterates within the industrialized world, global north, it would be at about 1 billion. So one prescription for advancing education was to hasten what's called the demographic transition. That is where families, instead of having 5, 6 children, would then move towards a smaller family of just having 1 or 2 children. This has been labeled as the one description of this is to have a bigger pie, that is to have more economic development, fewer forks, that is fewer children, smaller families, and better manners, so spending more on education and so on. We still face the problem of corruption and diversion of funds away from school. This happens within the education sector, this happens in other sectors as well. Problems such as bribing of teachers, which unfortunately we don't have enough of here. Just kidding. Lack of accurate data, so that's a problem we've been trying to assess, areas that we need to work on. And one area in which we're trying to make improvements is by doing controlled randomized experiments to try to understand more, have better knowledge on what kinds of interventions in certain contexts might try to improve things. Okay, so as of 2010, the UNESCO has gone through and done surveys and some analysis to try to figure out how much progress has been made. On several points, there have been progress. Back in 1999, there were 91 girls in school for every 100 boys. Now it's 97 girls for every 100 boys. So we are making progress on that. In secondary school, we see drop-off rates. Girls not attending secondary school as much. But actually, there are projections, and we have, if I can show this book, my colleagues here in the Pardee Center for Global Futures have put together this volume, Advancing Global Education Patterns of Potential Human Progress. And our prediction is that actually you're going to see over the next 30, 40 years major deficits in boys' education. Getting girls into school is a big problem, but once you get them into school, they not only stay there, but they do better than the boys. So boys are, especially at higher education and secondary school, dropping out and doing, non-school activities. We see the Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia are the 2 global regions most behind on school enrollment and literacy. Within Sub-Saharan Africa, we've seen an increase in primary school enrollment from 58% to 76%. That's a promising sign. We hope that that will that will continue to rise into the future. And though this is more of a health issue than education, we've seen that child mortality has decreased. It was 12 million a year back in 1990. It's 7.5. It's still an astonishingly high figure, but it has decreased compared to the past. Okay, some of the future challenges we have. Obviously, with all human rights, the real problem is not coming up with the right, but it's enforcing the right. It's the same way with education. We have to figure out ways to effectively provide it, have oversight and supervision. Some of the means that we can use are to have rewards. Several countries are giving cash transfers to families whose children are in education. Penalties for non-compliance. There's a variety of means that can be done. Threatening parents, giving them fines or small prison sentences for not sending their children to school. The state has to take its obligations seriously. Financing of the right to education. One way of doing this is through Gates Foundation. Other large foundations are sometimes channeling money into education, but the most sustainable long-term source is for the government to be able to take care of it is costs. So one means is strengthening government revenue. In a lot of developing countries, the government just doesn't collect enough revenue. A lot of times because the economy is weak, there's a lot of corruption in the process. The rates of their revenue service is not always the most functional. Secondly, guaranteeing that government expenditure actually goes to the education sector instead of into defense and other things. And thirdly, monitoring education spending to make sure it actually goes and makes a difference. Okay, that's all I'm going to talk about for today. I've got the links for the human rights-based approach to education for all that UNESCO puts out, and the MDG progress report, the most recent version, if you're interested.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Cord. I don't get enough opportunities to actually speak to students anymore. I mean, it's something that happens. You become a dean and then you go to the dark side. So it's a pleasure to actually talk to students and to receive questions from students. And it's a particular pleasure for me because really one of my first loves in terms of, I'm a sociologist, I have a PhD in sociology, and really actually the work that I did that undergirded my dissertation, a lot of the work that I did early on in my career really focused on comparative international higher ed. So it's great to be able to talk to students like Cornell. Having said that, I'm going to focus my comments on the U.S. educational system, particularly the K-12 system, meaning elementary and secondary school. Although I'd really be happy to talk about my research on South African higher ed, and also my experience in terms of what I did internationally for the Ford Foundation. I do think it's interesting, Kevin, that the two of the countries that haven't ratified a rights-based approach in the United States and South Africa, and I'd ask you maybe to think about why that's the case. What do they may potentially have in common? Because that's a research question that I've delved in many times. And in full disclosure, my family's from Cape Town, South Africa, and lived through apartheid. So education is really critical to our culture, in part because it was denied fundamentally in many ways. At any rate, I find it really interesting that we're talking about education now, because it seems that education has become the sexy, trendy thing to talk about in the United States. And that might seem odd because we've always been interested in education, but it is odd in my view for another reason. The Constitution says nothing about education. The U.S. Constitution does not prescribe a role for the federal government. It does not talk about education as a basic right. And probably one of the reasons that it's not ratified in terms of the rights approach is that it's never been part of the historical political culture of this country. All right, and I think that's a really important thing to point out. Yet at the same time, myself and a lot of other people have talked about education as the civil rights, the civil rights issue of the 21st century. But I think in saying that, I have to preface a couple of things and qualify. I really believe it is because it's at the intersection of so many things that undergird inequality. But at the same time, it's a little problematic as well because we've shifted the discourse around rights to focus on education at the expense of looking at some of the other things that are connected that you really can't look at in isolation if you really want to have a rights-based approach to democracy. So, one of the things that I find disturbing, and you're seeing it now in legal challenges in the United States, is a movement away from focusing on racial and ethnic discrimination. You can see that in the Fisher case, the affirmative action case that the Supreme Court will be actually reviewing, I think, on October 10th. You see it in the Keyes case here in Colorado, which is looking at the question of desegregation, and a number of court cases focused on desegregation in the K-12 arena. So while we're now focusing on educational reform, we've also sort of occluded the discussion of race and ethnicity and inequality as it relates to education, which really were the primary movers of educational reform from the 1950s all the way up to, you know, the last Supreme Court case at the University of Michigan, the Gratz and Grutter cases. So, you know, we might want to pause for a moment and again ask the question as to why are we now talking about education as a right, but at the same time we are beginning to narrow the ways in which we talk about inequality in general in this country. And I think there are a couple of reasons for it. And Claude mentioned that, you know, that when people talk about education as a right, some of you were surprised that when you listed the 50 top, you know, rights that would be important to people, that education would bubble up to the top. I would argue that it's not surprising in the United States. Because in many ways, if you think about education, education as a right is probably the least threatening, most palatable right that you could possibly embrace. Okay? And let's talk about that in concrete terms. If you look at it from the point of view of a right agenda, let's call the right agenda Republican agenda, although you could talk about that being a misnomer in some ways, because you could argue the Democrats, in terms of their education policies, are very similar to the Republicans. It's one of the only areas in which there's some congruence and agreement. But if you look at it from the point of view of education as a right, think about sort of the Republican principles of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, meritocracy, the idea that you're actually earning the opportunities you get, the notion of perseverance and hard work. All of those things play into a generalized notion of a Republican agenda. If you look at it on the other side, there isn't anyone in the country that doesn't believe in education, because education really is really about the American dream, right? I mean, it's aspirational, it's something thrust in the future, and it's also about trying to take advantage of all the opportunities that this country provides, provided that you work hard, etc., and that you're smart. So the reality is there is some agreement regarding the importance of education. And that's why I think it's become the least controversial of all the divisive issues in this country. Education is something that there is a sort of agreement on. And if you actually look at President Obama's policies, they're very technocratic. And if you look at Colorado, for example, there has been a sort of merging of Republican and Democrats for educational reform, revolving around the same kind of general principles. So you can look at that as saying that's a really positive thing. You finally have an issue that's critical to the nation's future, because it's absolutely critical. I mean, it's not just critical for developing nations, it's critical because if you look at education as a variable when you want to then start to analyze what impact it has, it reduces dependence on the state. It promotes civic participation, political participation. It reduces the likelihood of being incarcerated. It reduces the likelihood of child abuse. So we could go on and on and on in terms of the positive impact and consequences of education. So why is it a bad thing that both sides are really coming to terms with the fact that education is a right in society? It's not a bad thing. But I do want to sort of raise some questions around the narrowing of rights focused on education, because if you look at really the reforms right now in the United States around the K-12 arena, they're focused on that thing called the achievement gap. All right, and the achievement gap essentially is you take different groups, usually, and then you can divide them up any way you want. You look at socioeconomic status, you could look at ethnicity and race, you could look at national origin, and then you compare achievement standardized test scores usually, but the performance of students and compare them by groups, and you see this thing called an achievement gap. And it could be a black and white achievement gap. It could be a low socioeconomic and high socioeconomic achievement gap. But that gap has been stubborn and persistent for decades. And no matter how we actually engage in educational reform, well, we've had some really interesting reforms in cities like New York, Even in Denver, there have been some really interesting reforms, and you've seen the achievement rates en masse, on total, go up. That achievement gap still remains. So we haven't been able to address the achievement gap. So notice what's happened now. We've kind of shifted the discourse around redress. You know, if you think about the big court cases involving education, 1950s, the Board of Education, Brown versus Board of Education around desegregation, then 1978, the Bakke case involving affirmative action, et cetera, we're now no longer talking about race and discrimination and redress, and we're talking about addressing the achievement gap. And what that does then is it focuses solutions on this very narrow notion that if we address the achievement gap, if we equalize the performance of students of all races, of all classes, of all ethnicities, of all languages, then we've addressed a fundamental issue involving inequality in society, right? That is the premise. And so what you've got is a bunch of policies and money put into it by foundations like the Gates Foundation, through a very important foundation both internationally and nationally, that says, okay, what are some of the problems that we have to address to fix the achievement gap? Technocratic solutions. One is we need better data. Now, I'm in education. I'm the first to admit we absolutely need better data. We don't just need it in the developing world. We need it everywhere. So there's been a huge infusion of private money, of philanthropy money into addressing the data issues. How do we know that students are doing well? How do we measure good teaching? How do we do that in the 21st century with all of the unique attributes of what a 21st century student looks like? They don't look like the public school students of the 1950s. So there's one technocratic solution. The other is the private sector getting involved. Remember now, we're talking about public education. The last big public monopoly in the United States is education, all right? Meaning that all the discourse around unions, and you just saw the strike in Chicago, okay, is really focused on, are unions actually pro-kids or anti-kids? Are unions promoting positive educational reform or they're not? And a lot of that has to do with the private sector now moving into the educational field. Now you could argue that's a good thing, and there are elements of the private sector that I totally think the educational system on the public level needs. So I mean, there's a bottom line to the private sector. If profits don't go up, then the heads will roll, and it's not like the educational system where you have tenure, right, both at the K through 12 level and higher ed, and I'm in favor of tenure. I have tenure. But there is an emphasis on saying that innovation really comes from entrepreneurialism. Innovation comes from the private sector and the ways in which they've actually changed systems. So why don't we have the private sector and some of its ideas embedded into the public school system? And here we have charter schools, innovation schools, all right, and we have a lot of interesting for-profit entities moving into education right through the P all the way up to the 20, meaning through the elementary, secondary, and higher ed, okay? So this is happening right now at a time in which, I would argue, the only agreement that we have just before a major national election is that there hasn't been a lot of discussion about education. It really hasn't. A lot about taxes, a lot about jobs, a lot about abortion, a lot about, a bunch of cultural, social issues, but not a lot about education, okay? And I think that one of the problems when we focus more narrowly on education is that we lose the connections, the relationships between education as a right and what would we need to do in order to address education as a fundamental right. Well, let's look at the way that K through 12 education is funded in this country. It's funded through the property values of homes, primarily. Now, there are different ways to fund them. So, for example, there's some districts, big districts, like New York City, for example, that are called dependent districts. They come out of the budget of the governor, all right, and the mayors. But for the most part, districts are funded by the property values of homes. Now, if we go back and we think about that, that means that communities with low property values have less money to spend per pupil than communities with high property values. So there's immediately an inequity there based on what communities can spend that they derive from taxation. This state, Colorado, is a Tabor state. Anyone know what that is? Go ahead, please.
Oh God, it means that you can't increase taxes unless you ask the public, can we increase taxes? And the public never says yes. So
Right.
You can't take more money.
Nobody really is interested in increasing taxes, okay? I mean, but right now there's a bond, the mill levy, that's the DPS, the Denver Public Schools are asking voters to make a decision regarding infusing a lot of money into the Denver public school system, dilapidated buildings, new challenges. One of the fastest growing urban school districts in the nation is the Denver public school system. So there's an example in which the way that we fund education is not equally distributed. Okay? Then there are other issues, like, for example, the impact that lack of prenatal care has, and the impact that lack of pre-K opportunities for students, and the way that many students come into kindergarten already 2 years behind in terms of that competition. We all like to believe the United States is about equal competition. We can't guarantee equal results, but we should allow everybody the equal opportunity to succeed or fail on their own merit. But we're finding a huge disjuncture there. So students are coming into kindergarten already disadvantaged. Then you have the competing funding interests that are set up structurally in the government, meaning that most ways in which K-12 funding occurs beyond taxes comes through the governor and the mayor's budget. And the governors and the mayor's budget have to compete with other line items in the budget. Anyone want to guess what some of those are? We talked about them, you saw them in some of the slides. Medicare, Medicaid, okay? Prison industrial complexes, correctional services. K-12 competes with higher ed. So all of these competing funding demands are happening at the same time. So we've had, this country incarcerates more people than anyone, in terms of its population size, than anyone in the history of the nation, of the world, okay? And that comes from, the correctional services comes from the same budget and the same line items that fund or do not fund K-12 education. So I'll end fairly soon, but what I'm trying to highlight is that yes, education is absolutely a right. It should be a fundamental right. And no, it's not in the Constitution. But we've seemed to fast track to this idea that it should be a right without thinking about the ways in which saying that and working on the achievement gap don't address the fundamental inequalities that make it impossible for education to be a right. All right? And I would argue that it's not an achievement gap for the most part. I think if you look at science and you look at intelligence testing, etc., with all of its problems, to be truthful, most groups are equally distributed, meaning that they're not, there are some issues involving gaps and achievement gaps, but when you really look at it, the argument you could make is that intelligence is equally distributed across groups, but opportunity is not equally distributed. And so that's really where we need to focus our attention. And I would argue on the left and the right in this country, they're sort of mired more in this very narrow view of how we're going to address educational inequality. It's as if you came to a doctor and you have an ulcer, and the doctor provides some medication to stop the ulcer and the bleeding without asking you a fundamental question. How much do you eat per day? Do you have resources enough to feed yourself? Which is also, incidentally, if you read the work of Claude Ake, is a fundamental basic right, the right to food. Okay? So it may not be as extreme in the United States, but remember now that the United States sort of represent, whether we like it or not, whether we're proud of it or not, it represents one of those sort of bellwether nations by which other nations measure themselves. And in this regard, education, given the amount of resources this country has, education is really a poor example of a government program. It doesn't work properly and we don't fund it equally. And so I would argue that yes, it's a right. But for it to be a meaningful right, we're going to have to go back to some of the issues that we've actually occluded, because now our focus is on education. And I know that may seem like an oxymoron or a paradox or contradiction, but I think social issues are always interconnected. Whether we're talking about the HIV and AIDS pandemic, or we're talking about education, or we're talking about civil wars, they're interconnected. And so I think it's really important that we start to open this up again and start to contest what rights mean in this country, and don't focus solely and narrowly on education, even though it's a critical, important theme and issue to work on. Thank you.
Dr. Anderson, Professor Doshi, thank you both again for being here. And at this time, I'd like to open it up to questions anybody may have. Those are both fantastic, both covered domestic and abroad and talked about interrelated issues. Thoughts? Yes?
Is there any agreement on how to evaluate teachers in schools? And are those methods available to poorer schools or developing countries?
I'll answer the part year, and then I'll rely on you to answer the second part, although I think the answer is no, in general. But there are attempts to do so. There's a value-added, very sophisticated statistical method that was developed out of Stanford with a lot of private donor money, Broad, Wallace, etc., that is trying to tie teacher evaluation to student performance. Some of the problems with that are methodologically, how do you evaluate a student's transformation if you just rely primarily on student achievement scores, which are derived primarily from standardized tests. One of the things that are interesting about Colorado is that they are a little more sophisticated. The state has a growth model, so it doesn't. So if you started 2 grades below, and you at the end of 1 year are 1 grade above where you were, even though you're still 1 grade below, the growth model allows you to look at that as a major success. What they're doing now, though, and this is really sort of about the teachers' unions, they're saying that if teachers are going to, and this is affecting colleges and schools of education, once teachers go into the classroom, they have an ID number. That ID number is connected to student achievement data, and if their student achievement data does not show progress, then they could lose their jobs and their tenure. So that's happening now, and I think as a segue to Devin, I think the biggest problem we're having in Colorado is that we have legislation, it's Senate Bill 191, the educator effectiveness legislation, but we don't have the funding to do what we would need to do to create the assessments, the tools, the technology, the professional development for teachers and principals, right, in order to have an effective system. So we have all the legislation and policy in place, we don't have the funds. And this is a very wealthy country, so.
I'll just add that we know that teachers play a very pivotal role in schooling and education system. But when we do statistical studies controlling for a wide range of factors, actually the most consistent finding is that parental level of education and parental income are the biggest predictors of student performance. So while teacher quality is an important issue, it seems that there are other issues that trump the teacher training and teacher evaluation and so on in terms of guaranteeing the basic rights of education.
So, Dr. Joshi, in your slide, you have, was it 20% of government spending and 6% of GDP as a target?
That's right.
For
That's
spending?
UNESCO's target.
Well, do you know what our nation's actual spending is?
I don't, but I could look that up.
It's much higher than that, I think, in the sense that you have to look at education as federal government doesn't, so it's lower from the point of view of federal government. But when I talked about the private sector, the infusion of capital into the educational system has been pretty dramatic. I mean, the Gates Foundation alone supersedes many states' budgets in terms of the infusion. The problem with that is there are certain qualifications or certain stipulations associated with it, and it's not sustainable. I think, you know, it's not, we have a funding shortage, but not a funding problem. There's enough funding to provide high quality education. We don't have a minimum standard by which everyone has to adhere to per student, per pupil. So that's a big issue. So it's hard because the federal government doesn't have a formal role, but the amount of capital that's being pushed into the system is pretty overwhelming. The one thing I did mention in my talk is that the private sector is not just doing this because it's altruistic. The private sector is doing it because there's supply and there's demand, all right? The demand for education is at an all-time high, right? An all-time high, and therefore it's an opportunity for the private sector to make a buck. If you don't believe that that's not happening, look at the private loans controversies that are happening. And then the for-profits that have emerged in part because of the recapitulation of the GI Bill. Right? So there are a lot of really unscrupulous private lenders and for-profits that are exploiting the government money, the federal money that's coming from the GI Bill. So there's tons of money. It's not being allocated properly. And there are some big accountability issues that we have to address that in partly are connected to the unions. I'm not saying that the unions aren't partially responsible for this. So, you know, our problem is not money. You know, our problem is the allocation of resources equity.
I just add that the total education spending from all sources, public, private, voluntary, exceeds those targets that UNESCO puts in the U.S. But those targets, which are for developing countries, are for public spending. That is government spending, and usually that's the aggregate of all different ones, local, provincial, and central. But some studies have suggested that when the central government in particular takes an interest in education funding, that has a larger impact than when the central government sort of stands back and has a more decentralized funding of education.
And real quick, if you don't mind speaking up when you ask your question, just so over here. Thanks.
Sure. This one's for you. We talked a little bit before about South Africa. Their tertiary system was set up to meet a specific goal in Africa. I want to check in with you. I mean, it's been a really rough go to equalize that. What's the status of it today? Do you know?
Well, that's a really hard question because apartheid was in existence for, almost 50 years. And actually much longer than that, because the policies of racial discrimination from the British and the Dutch, were really centuries old. So the system was never created to support the majority of people, right? So in fact, if you look at from 1948 to around 1994, I should say, when the ANC came into power, the total amount spent on the majority of the population versus the white population, it's not just Afrikaners, it's also the English, right? They're the two major ethnic groups within the white population, was much higher than the entire money spent on the majority of the population, which would equal well over 80%. So they've inherited an incredibly inequitable system. That's the one thing. Then the second thing is the bureaucracy was set up like for indigenous Africans, they had what they called the Bantu system. The Bantu system meant, it was an anthropological term which said that we were respecting their cultures, but it really was based incidentally on the reservation system here in the United States. So the apartheid architects built it on the way that we did the reservations here. And then you had the ministry, so you had the Ministry of Bantu Affairs, you had the Ministry of Colored Affairs, which were mixed race people, where my parents are mixed race, quote unquote. You had the Ministry of Indian Affairs, and then you had the Ministry of Education, right, which was for whites, right? They didn't have a name, which was the Ministry of Education. So the ANC inherited what was a system that had no intention to educate the majority of the population. So with that said, they're not doing that well, right? Because they have a huge, they're one of the countries with the highest Gini coefficient in terms of inequality. And while the ANC came to power and I was there in 94 and 95, the transformation was fundamental to the country, and I would never belittle it. But it didn't change the distribution of resources. The distribution of resources stays the same. It's predominantly controlled by a very small portion of the population, and that, for the most part, that population remains white, although with the ANC and the entrepreneurial programs, there's now an emerging black middle class and upper class. But, so the system had to be totally restructured. And what they did is they closed down a lot of institutions that were actually built to not educate the majority, were built to stratify and track them into particular labor markets, right? My grandfather was a principal, right? But there were only the two highest positions that mixed race folks could have were principals and priests. And notice that was gender, right? So the ANC had to deal with the fact that they had a system that didn't really have universal access. Then they had a quality issue. Do you close down the inequitable colleges and universities that were race-based? So there were race-based institutions that were only for colors, only for Xhosa, only for Zulus. They had institutions like that. Do you close them down by no fault of their own because they were underfunded and they were of poor quality? Or do you raise them up? It's like the turnaround school. Do you use the same staff and principal and repurpose them, or do you close them down? And so the ANC decided to merge a lot of institutions, to close down a lot of institutions. And so really, their system is in flux at the moment. And then they have the biggest problem is they can't redistribute wealth and jobs, right? I mean, that's, there was a negotiated settlement. The negotiated settlement said that they couldn't do what the ANC originally, what they proposed to do, which was redistribute wealth. If you read the Congress, the charter, it's nationalize the mines, nationalize the banks. None of that happened. It was a negotiated settlement. So they made some inroads, and there's definitely been an increase or a diversification of the universities. But I'd argue that they moved now from talking about race to now talking about socioeconomic status. So when you see black students in really elite, previously white institutions, that's because their parents are pretty wealthy. It's not because they're black necessarily. I don't think that's the determining variable.
Kelly?
Specifically to Dr. Joshi, when you give a statistic about the increased enrollment rates since '99 and 2010, I'm curious if there's ever been anything towards increased attendance and the disparity between, even though enrollment rates are higher, is attendance actually higher, particularly towards girls' education? Because I sometimes think that looking at the macro, big picture, enrollment rates up, that means that we're moving forward. And I'm sure that it does to a degree, but I think taking it down to a more micro analysis, when you look at the attendance rates and see if it's also some work that I've done. We were supposed to this was about 24 girls in South Sudan where I was working, and we set up a time prior, told the teachers that we were going to be there, and the date we got there, 11 of the 24 were attending. So the enrollment rate had increased. It's obviously a specific instance, but clearly the attendance was not increasing with the enrollment for various reasons. So I didn't know if there was any work on that.
Yeah, so this is the trick. So if you are a principal or you're a local government official in somewhere in a village or in a neighborhood in a town in Africa, in South Asia, Latin America, you have cookies and punch and other goodies on the first day of school. And all the parents come out and the kids come in and you make sure to get their names written down in the register. And then the second day of school, is not so important. And the drop-off may be 40%, 50% from the first day of school to the second day of school. But the enrollment figures, which will be then sent off to the provincial Ministry of Education or provincial collecting point, and then further perhaps massaged and then sent off to the central government statistical collecting point, will be able to report figures that are favorable. So we know that there's always a gap between the enrollment rate and the attendance rate. The UNESCO MDG progress report only reports the enrollment rate, so I'm just reporting what I've read from their reports. So I am also skeptical that the attendance is rising as fast as the enrollment rates that they report. On the other hand, there is an incentive for the local principals and mayors and so on, when it comes time for foundations or for international organizations to assess which districts are most in need of resources, to wipe some names off of the school register and say that, oh, actually half of our girls are not in school right now. I think the incentives are more of the first type, where you get the inflation rather than the underreporting. But the short answer is the attendance data has not been as forthcoming, partly because it's more difficult to collect. But I don't know the exact.
We'll go ahead and take two more. I saw 2 minutes in the front. Go ahead.
So yeah, I want to talk a little bit about the incentive structure for students and the larger education system itself and give comments. Because things that stick out to me when I read UDHR 26 is that the education should be dedicated to the full development of the human personality. And for the ICESCR, whatever, the things that stick out to me are that quality in terms of relevance of the curriculum and the participatory rights of students in their education are all highlighted. For me, those things do not exist in our education system. In terms of aiming at the full development of the personality, we all know that STEM is king. in the US education system because the money's there. Because the incentives for the entire education system is to produce credentials, not educations, degrees that will qualify people to get these kinds of jobs that help the economy, because artists don't, and physical education doesn't. And in terms of relevant curriculum, that has continuing impacts in. I graduated high school knowing calculus and trigonometry, but I didn't know anything about media literacy. I didn't know how to read a lease. Any of the things that I would have needed to go on and be a functioning adult society, many of those things were left. Many of the things that you need to know in this country are left you don't learn about them until the education is no longer free. And in terms of participation, at no point did anyone ever ask me in my entire participation, 20-something years of school in the US, what would you like to learn? So I want to know, how do these things impact the discourse in this country, especially in terms of participation in schools, where in higher ed, you can't have a university without slews of young people paying tons of money to make this institution possible, and then not having a great deal of the ability to determine how they participate in their learning and what they learn. So what are your thoughts on those conditions?
Why don't I'll give a brief response and then turn it over to Greg. The really brief responses, and I don't mean to say this as a joke, and I regret to say this, is the U.S. is not a signatory. The U.S. has not ratified the ICESCR. So though that's kind of coming as someone in the education field, that's a lame excuse. I would sort of back Greg's assertion that probably the more structural, systematic reasons why the U.S. never signed the ICER in the first place has to do with the deep inequalities of the society, socioeconomic, racial, etc. But I suppose, I would basically agree with what you were saying, and say that from the perspective of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, your rights, and probably everyone in this room's rights, have been violated. And I suppose if we all stood out and did a strike and didn't go to class and blocked the highway and and not just Denver, but like everyone across the country, then things might change. In fact, that's how things changed in South Africa, and that's how things have changed in some countries. But until there's mass organization, until there's some political party that will actually stand for that, if both of the major parties are not, not pursuing the kind of UDHR type of education that we're supposed to have a right to, that we'd like to see, then it's going to be difficult to change. That's what I think.
It's a big question. It's a good question. I think the two reasons why South Africa and the United States haven't ratified it is in the case of the United States, it's political will, absolutely, and it's we talk about it as a right. The one thing is like label me and you negate me. You call it a right, then nobody has to do anything about it, right? So there's that. But there's also a deep cultural, historical antagonism to the idea that the state should be fundamentally guaranteeing certain rights, regardless of who that person is or where they come from. In the case of South Africa, you asked I think it's just economics. It's the reason why Mbeki opposed antiretroviral drugs is because he did the math and he knew South Africa couldn't afford them. This is before the generic patents. So I know that sounds horrible. I'm sure you would deny it. I'm sure you're pretty disgusted if I said it in front of you. I'd probably be scared to say it in front of them. But I think that there's a political economy to it, and they can't ratify it because they can't afford to equalize. Remember, we're not talking about a minority when we think about people of color in this society, which they're not a minority incidentally in lots of states, but they're a minority nationwide. We're talking about a majority, so that the reallocation of resources to that would be fundamental to a society that's not willing to take on the big issues that they negotiated away. To come to and it is about resources, to come specifically to your question, if you look at high quality education in elementary and secondary formats, Private schools have no problem doing away with the very things that we're moving towards. They have no problem not using standardized tests. They have no problem bringing the arts in fundamentally. They have no problem with student-centered curricula. None of those issues ever impact the way that private schools operate. Because, to be truthful, elite parents know that those things are critical. The more multi-contextual elements of learning you give to your kids, the more you actually empower them to do anything in this world. But in the public school arena, it's all technocratic. Standardized test scores, achievement gap, STEM, not STEAM. You don't put the A in it, you put the STEM, because STEM is really about labor outcomes. So there is a kind of discourse for the public and a discourse for those that can afford to include that discourse. And that really is fundamental to the United States. You know, and I think until we come to terms with the fact that, yeah, accountability is critical, we have to make sure that teachers are doing good jobs, that schools are reaching levels in which students can read, that the literacy, Cuba has a higher literacy rate than this country, and it has so for decades, okay? So we have to come to terms with that, but we're not addressing those issues, and unfortunately, it's kind of a lie, because it isn't just about a credential. You know, there's a reason why voter suppression is occurring around a driver's license, and what else? What's the other one? Passport. Passport. Think about that for a moment, right? Students that don't, or people that who are eligible to vote, but in certain states because of legislation and policy changes can't because they don't have a passport. What does that say? It says that they haven't had an opportunity to see the rest of the world. That context is being very segregated. So yeah, everybody really knows what works, but it comes down to resources. Do we really want to commit to giving a private education to all the folks that are in public ed? And think about the consumers of public ed. They've changed dramatically in 50 years. The consumers of public ed are low-income students of color. And that ain't going to change, people. The demographics are shifting dramatically. California is a majority minority state. Texas is about to be a majority minority state. New York is about to be a majority minority state. Florida is about to be a majority minority state. I can go on and on. It's just rolling. It's happening. It's a domino effect. So until we address that, which would require kind of civil disobedience and a civic kind of political movement, which we haven't had since the 1960s here. You know, we're never going to address it. And then you have to be vigilant about it, because South Africa addressed it. So that was critical to the ANC and the UDF. And then when they came into power, guess what happened? They shifted, right? They shifted because they made compromises. So, but this nation, it's not about resources. It's about political will. And it's about culture. It's about culture in both a positive and a pejorative sense. In terms of who belongs, who doesn't, who should have that right, who doesn't, who should be tested, who doesn't need it.
I think one last question.
A lot of pressure on the last question. Do you really genuinely, actually believe that the achievement gap is like a fair testament to education? Because I think the best that you can hope for is that those that are ahead slow down and those that are behind speed up. Don't you kind of want that they both end up at the top of the world? Like, well, how fair of a test is it really?
I don't think it's look, I believe in merit, all right? Because I'm here, standing here, I believe in merit. Everybody that succeeds believes in merit. I haven't heard one person that said, I became a head of a company because I was really crappy and dumb, all right? And I got all these benefits because nobody said, everybody believes what they got, they deserve. So even though the question of merit is problematic, it's a fundamental aspect of human nature. But we're not talking about achievement. To me, we're talking about opportunity. And that's the gap that we should be talking about. It's an opportunity gap. And to come to the question about boys and girls, by the time they get to secondary education, one of the big issues in the developing world is that opportunity gap comes back again because their family responsibilities are much deeper than those of boys, right? And so when you get to the secondary level, you start to see, yeah, we're seeing the changes. We're seeing that gap getting addressed. But the gap really is a resource and opportunity gap. So no, I don't believe in the achievement gap. I do believe we can, look, there are people, every day I come to the university and I listen to someone and go, geez, that person's really a lot smarter than me, you know, and I can figure that out, you know. But to try to talk about, well, where does that, in a hierarchy, where would that person fit in a meritocracy? Meaning that why does an ambulance driver that likely saves your life way more than a basketball player get paid such crappy salary, right? Because we decided one is more important than the other. Again, that's a moral political issue. That's not a meritocratic issue. So no, I don't believe in the achievement gap as it's currently structured. I believe that there are innate differences. I can't draw, you know? I can't. I can just stick people, but I can't draw. It's just something I can't do. You know, I can play music though, so something innate about me allowed me to play music, but I can't draw. So, yeah, you know, but so I'm saying that what we can do is guarantee equal opportunity. We can't guarantee equal results, but right now we're not guaranteeing equal opportunity. And it's worse in the developing world because they have less resources, a lot more social problems that can't be contained through policies, legislation, through civics organizations, through foundations, etc. It's way more dramatic in the developing world.
But a lot of analysis suggests that the U.S. is moving in that direction. Towards the developing world.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Towards greater inequality, towards greater opportunity gap.
But the difference here, and they are, but here's the problem in terms of political will. I've been to Nigeria. When the Nigerian police stop you and take your sunglasses, you know what corruption feels like in your bones. You know, because they just took your crap from you. All right? When a government, like when the United States or Canada, okay, Canada decides to put a committee together to see whether we needed nuclear, because I lived in Canada, we needed nuclear submarines. They put together all of the arms corporations on the committee, and guess what? We got nuclear submarines. Nobody moans about that being corruption, because it's not right in your face. So while, yeah, the inequality here is pretty bad, the amount of opportunities and resources sort of obfuscate it. You know, people don't get really, really angry about it. And again, the idea is you always feel a lot better if you can point at someone else who's not as well off as you. And then say, well, that's because they're not as good as you. Right? It's kind of human nature, so you get all of that conflated. So I totally agree, but I'm not optimistic that the politics are driving us towards change in this direction.
Fired up, like
The Hollywood happy ending. And then now it's time for cream puffs.
No, in all honesty, I couldn't have asked for a better framing for the theme for the upcoming year. The passion that's in the topic, I think, reflects the importance of the topic. Dr. Joshi, thank you again for coming and speaking for us. Thank you all for attending. We appreciate having you here. Again, Center on Rights Development, we already have events planned for the upcoming year. We're going to be talking about female right to education in Africa. We have some people who are resident experts on that, so stay tuned for details to come. And the part you've all been waiting for, please join us for delicious dessert and beverages in the back. Thank you again.